Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third week of our class. So I've finished getting your week one focus questions back to you now, and I want to say collectively you're doing well on them. I think you're thinking about the authors, you're weighing in on them, and you're giving me good analytical answers. So you're really doing the work of this course well so far. Keep up the good work. So I really enjoy giving you a diversity of readings, a diversity of perspectives. So there's not like one single type of reading or perspective on agriculture that you're going to get in this class. So if any of you are having a hard time with these readings, please reach out to me. Some of you already have. Thank you. This is the third week of the class, so if you've fallen behind or feel overwhelmed or anything, it's by no means too late to still figure things out. So and talking about history, that's my favorite thing to do. So I never mind doing that. And just remember, I have open office hours every morning from 9 to 10 a.m. And if those don't work for you, if those times don't work for you, just send me an email, and we can either email or I could set up a different Zoom session with you. Other times are available for me as well. So yeah, this week we are getting into the famine part of this course's title. So this is a major shift from where we were last week. I haven't graded any of your week two focus questions yet, and I've only looked at one of your discussion board posts, but it was by Abby, and her discussion board was basically nostalgically looking back at baling hay. And in the discussion board, I asked you to talk about the pros and cons of a technology, and the con you came up with was that balers break down, which is annoying. This is a completely different discussion today. There's nothing warm, fuzzy feeling at all about what we're talking about today or this week. So just prepare you for that. And more seriously, I did put a trigger warning in to some of these readings because especially the Robert Conquest reading can be, you know, uh, extremely violent and disturbing. So you actually can skip over some of those pages, and I told you what pages you can skip, which will in no way affect your comprehension or ability to answer those focus questions or understand his thesis. Okay, so I again changed the readings a bit this week, making sure to honor my syllabus in not increasing your page limit load from what's written there. But I had originally planned to really focus your readings on just the technical aspects of implementing collective agriculture in the USSR. But I wanted to broaden them to situate the consequences of this policy to include the famine, not just the policies and hatreds that caused the famine, and that's the Holodomor. So I cut the reading by Lynn Viola short and added a chapter from really a classic book called Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest that really defined the Ukrainian famine, or Holodomor, for people outside of the Ukrainian diaspora and a handful of academics. So in this slide that you're looking at, you've got, well, me in the middle, but then you've got two competing propaganda pictures from the early 1930s. So the first on the left is a pro collectivization poster, so the idea of having collective agriculture, having people work together on state-run farms. And this poster from the early 1930s defines who the enemies of collectivization are imagined to be. So the poster says, in our kolkhoz, which is a collective farm, there's no place for papists, meaning religious people, or kulaks, meaning wealthy farmers or those who exploit the labor of others. So as you'll see in this presentation and readings for this week, the effects of these brutal collectivization campaigns with posters like this were especially harsh among Ukrainians. Thus, by the time of World War II, Nazi and other fascist organizations successfully recruited thousands of Ukrainians into their ranks. Many Ukrainians thought the Nazis were a viable option to fight against the Soviet power that had done so much harm to Ukrainians. So the second poster is a Nazi poster. It's written in Ukrainian, and it says, "Join the ranks in the fight against Bolshevism in the ranks of the Galician Division," which was a Nazi-led Ukrainian SS division that played a key role in the murder of Europe's Jews, especially in running the death camps. So I just give you two horrific propaganda posters whose effects was you know, hopefully beyond our ability to comprehend. So this is a bloody period we're covering with plenty of suffering and guilt among that is widespread. So let's jump back in time now. Let me try and advance. All right. So before we get into collective agriculture, I want to jump back to ground the Soviet communist approach to farming. In the 1930s, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union drew its ideology from Marxism, as interpreted by prominent Soviet ideologues like Vladimir Lenin and, more importantly, Joseph Stalin. Stalin wasn't the only communist thinker, of course. He had just, by this period, marginalized the other major thinkers. He would later have most of them killed. So Marxism, though, it dates back to the writings of Karl Marx, who was active between the 1840s and 1870s as a writer and thinker. So one of Marx's key contributions was to take the many strands of thought that made up the socialism of his day and combine them into a single unified ideology that had a mix of scientific sounding and dogmatic certainty to it. Socialism was a response to the Industrial Revolution. Early socialist thinkers wondered why, with all the wealth generated from labor saving machines, were people working harder and making less money. They came up with various methods to make the machines work for people rather than the other way around. So Marx, in his theory of what he called communism, thought human societies were evolving toward a certain brighter future. And like so many theorists of the era, he tried to have a theory of everything that could be scientifically applied to making or at least analyzing human progress. So Marxism, as he envisioned it, saw the good in people and believed in human beings' potential for improvement. In the Marxist system of evolution, humanity started in a state of nature, much like Enlightenment thinkers such as Jean Jacques Rousseau or John Locke envisioned it. Then they progressed into a stage of barbarism, where leaders were able to siphon off excess labor to get people to build things like the pyramids of Egypt or Roman aqueducts. Then people progressed into feudalism, where privileged nobles owned people's excess labor through an economic system that revolved around large agricultural manors. In order to make this economic system work, though, rulers always allowed merchants to congregate in cities. These city dwellers, or bourgeoisie, bourge, which just, means a town in French, were the productive force who learned to intelligently invest and use capital to maximize their returns. Eventually, they would replace feudalism with a system where noble privilege no longer mattered. Only those who had money or capital, hence capitalism. So the people in charge of capitalism are those who make the decisions, who have the money that allows them to make the decisions. So Marx spent a lot of time in the Communist Manifesto and in other writings actually praising the productive power of capitalism, along with its extractive and exploitative power. He saw it as a power that created the modern world by unifying its productive forces. But capitalism, for Marx, pits the bourgeoisie against the workers. What he called the workers, he called, using a Roman term, the proletariat. It's not a flattering term for the Romans. It just means breeders. But he, sort of re-owned it as a term that he could be proud of. So ultimately, workers, for Marx, must seize control of the means of production to enter the next phase, socialism. He and Engels cover many variants of socialism in the manifesto. For Marx and Engels, eventually the state under socialism would wither away, and people would reach an anarchic stage of communism, where people were enlightened enough to manage the economy and society without any form of oversight or coercion. It was almost a return to the state of nature. But a state of nature with machines and factories and, an ideal society. So in classical Marxism, each society had to pass through each of these evolutionary stages, and he believed in 1848 that much of the world was ready to enter the next stage of socialism. So a lot happened here. I'll put my face in here. I'll be down here next to these uh, fellows. So a lot happened between the decades of 1848 and the revolution of 1917 in Russia. One of the key debates that emerged among socialists in the various socialist internationals was whether the stages of evolution Marx described would happen through naturally occurring revolutions, as he believed, or whether a sort of revolutionary vanguard might not be able to jumpstart revolutions, by helping people to develop more class consciousness. So, another debate was whether the stages of communism necessarily needed to be followed. As revolutionaries tried to implement communism across the world during the 20th century, they quickly found they'd need to improvise, as the neat stages and patterns that Marx outlined didn't really exist anywhere. So while Marxism informed earlier revolutionary movements like the French Commune or the Easter Uprising in Ireland, the Russians were the first to establish a state socialist state fully committed to achieving communist. So in February 1917, Russians overthrew their Tsarist government and established a full republic. When this happened, Russian communists split between the more radical Bolsheviks and the more moderate Mensheviks were largely caught off guard. Lenin was in exile at Switzerland at the time and was secretly transported via sealed train by the Germans back into Russia. They knew he would cause problems for their enemy during World War I. Both factions of the Russian Communist Party cautiously welcomed the revolution, and the more moderate Menshevik wing of the Communist Party was actually willing to work quite a bit with the new government. The Bolsheviks, however, spent the next few months really scheming to take power and trying to figure out how to establish a socialist government in a country that all agreed was still really in the feudal stage of development. Remember, Marx said societies needed to pass through the stages of development in order to progress, so capitalism needed to follow feudalism, then become socialism. So Vladimir Lenin, whose ideas came to be called Marxist Leninism, believed in the idea that stages of communism could be moved through more quickly over so-called through so-called permanent revolution, where workers would control economic development. So over the next 4 years, his Bolshevik party fought against various supporters of the old government called Whites and Greens, along with contingents of British, Czech, U.S., and French forces who were initially sent to Russia to take back war material that had been loaned to the previous government, not to the Bolsheviks. So, I'm giving you all of this background just to help try to ground the ideology that justified mass murder. So, progressing here, come on. All right, I'll put myself by Bukharin. All right. So during the war, several prominent ideologues arose, arguing over how best to administer the revolution and build a state thereafter. So people like Trotsky in the middle wanted to jumpstart the revolution globally, immediately. He believed that, with the end of World War I, the world was ready to jump into revolution. And Trotsky was a close confidant of Lenin and formed the Communist International Organization, the Comintern, dedicated to fomenting revolution all over the world. Though he quickly fell into disfavor, his support of global revolutions really isolated the Soviet Union. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with a country that was causing revolutions, that was essentially supporting terrorists in their own home countries. Many were leery even to trade with this radical new government. So, in his period of favor, though, Trotsky wasn't really concerned with things like trade. When it came to agriculture, the only thing he really cared about was making sure the peasants could take over the land of wealthy landowners. Trotsky believed that the world was on the edge of a massive global revolution, so ideally, the wealthy capitalist countries would easily be able to supply the poorer countries like Russia. Trotsky was considered the early head of the left wing of the Bolshevik Party. The right wing of the party coalesced around Nikolai Bukharin, who wanted to gradually move towards socialism. Bukharin was a key architect of the new economic plan, which ran roughly from, well, I wrote 1921 to 1928, 29. Bukharin and his followers argued that the devastation of the war meant that Russia wasn't ready yet for socialism. There was nothing to socialize after all. Instead, Russians needed to allow for private enterprise to build an economy first, while maintaining a strong state sector, then slowly move to take control of the entire economy. It was under, and in Russian, they just use the acronym is the same. They're cognates in Russia, so NEP, or Russians just call it NEP. So NEP policies that It was under them that peasants were given control over land. So one of the Bolshevik promises in 1917 to give people bread was being honored by allowing the people who worked the land to have ownership of it as well. So these small private farmers were able to pull the Soviet Union out of an earlier famine they had experienced at the end of their civil war in 1922. Unfortunately, these reforms, especially the agricultural ones, were short lived. So the person who ultimately rose to prominence, Lenin died in 1924, but the person who rose to prominence, leading the party by the end of the 1920s, was Joseph Stalin. Uh, so Stalin initially agreed with the right wing of the party in the 1920s as he was slowly building a base of support. But by the end of the 1920s, he turned on them and allied himself with the left wing of the party, arguing that socialism could be achieved by skipping over the stage of capitalism. So to accomplish this, he argued that the state needed to invest in large infrastructural projects. He called this, building socialism in one country. Give up on global revolutions and just work to build it here at home. So if Russia could build its own steel mills, hydroelectric dams, canals, and most importantly, factories for heavy manufacturing, they would be able to defend themselves from what he believed to be imminent war, and they could sort of kickstart socialism. So and this is a picture of the Magnitogorsk steel mill, which was built under Stalinism, and this is what it looked like in the 1930s. And when it was built, it was the largest steel mill in the world. Stalin was obsessed with those kinds of things, having the biggest, the best of everything. So to fund this industrialization, Stalin hoped to force farmers to become more efficient. So one term that refers to this period is the scissors crisis. Those were his efforts to lower, and this occurred earlier as well, to lower prices farmers were paid and increase prices people paid for food. So separating like scissors, lower what you pay, raise what you gain, and like the spreading apart of the end of scissors, in order to basically create a surplus of funds that could be invested in building giant factories like this. So, to compensate, he would force farmers into collective farms where things could ideally be done more efficiently so that low prices for farm products could still work. And, a collective farm would ideally be run efficiently like a factory. It would involve large amounts of mechanization, freeing up the majority of people employed in agriculture to take part in industry. So in theory, it's not a bad idea, and we have several successful cooperative, collective farms right here in Delaware County. But nobody in Delaware County is collective farming at the end of a gun barrel either. So I should point out too that in so much of the rhetoric of this period, across communist movements, there was disdain for peasants. That would change, especially with the rhetoric of Mao Zedong. But in this period, they were considered backwards, superstitious, controlled by religions, and ultimately a sort of petite bourgeoisie. So little bourgeoisie who weren't as class conscious as the workers. Peasants were mini capitalists, while industrial workers were the ideal Soviet men and women. So this feature of Stalinism in particular that spread across communist countries wasn't always so extreme. I mean, the very symbol of the USSR, the hammer of the worker, was joined to the sickle of the peasants. But as repressive policies against peasants ensued, it seems that so many communist functionaries, failed to look at their flag. So let me skip ahead. All right, so your Viola reading deals with the hastening of the campaign to collectivize agriculture after 1929. In 1929, Stalin whipped up another war fever. It wasn't the first time he had done this, wasn't the last time. It wasn't an unfounded fear either. I mean, renegade Ukrainians, Uzbek rebels, and even worrisome Polish nationalists constantly plied at the border regions of the USSR. What Stalin worried about, though, was that in the event of sustained war, which they were still recovering from, remember their civil war was only 7 years earlier, the Soviet Union didn't have sufficient food reserves or heavy industry to really sustain a fight. So he felt that to increase agricultural productivity and free up people and funds for industry, he needed to completely abandon the Dnieper system and move full steam ahead with collectivizing agriculture. So, in reading Viola and Conquest, it can sometimes seem hard to fathom how Stalin was able to get away with the oppressive things he did. Uh, there's a recent book I've cited down here by Wendy Goldman, who shows that in many respects Stalin was able to do these kinds of things because of the cult-like devotion of his followers. Stalin was immensely popular among a lot of Russians for his plain style of speech and his constant purges of officials he accused of corruption. No one likes corruption, but Stalin made fun of the people he purged. He masterfully divided Russians against each other with constant propaganda about class enemies, enemies of the people. They were the stuck up, incompetent idiots who were preventing him from making Russia great. So, one uncomfortable aspect of Stalin's oppressiveness, even including his murders, is that he was often supported by the population who felt like he was punishing people who needed to be punished because they weren't on the same team. Many Soviets cheered, for example, when the infamous show trials began, when the insane purges of the 1930s occurred. Many were in favor. And in the late 20s, when I'm saying many, I'm not saying all. There were wonderful people who opposed this. There are people who always oppose oppression. But in the late 1920s, when he began deporting successful or even seemingly successful farmers known as kulaks, people in cities, the workers who received so much affection, were oftentimes happy about it. So anytime, and that's one of the reasons I gave you the reading by Maurice Hindus as well, is he shows a perspective of what people in Moscow, the showcase city of the USSR, what their lives were like at the same time that the Holodomor was going on. And it's eerie to read, and you only see little hints of a massive murderous genocidal famine happening in his reading. So anytime Stalin had a campaign to do something, anything, and it inevitably failed because of poor planning and his own incompetence, rather than take responsibility, he would find a class of people to blame. So when early collectivization didn't measure up to his lofty dreams, he blamed kulaks. Taking their land, deporting them, and sometimes killing them were all means to change the face of the countryside into large, efficient collective farms. The problem was these farms were often run by people without agricultural experience. They weren't supplied with seeds, fertilizers, or despite the many propaganda posters, proper machinery either. And so they naturally floundered. Stalin didn't want competent people, though. He wanted loyal people. So, one thing Viola does nicely is to show that brutality was often the fault of local officials interpreting their orders more harshly than they were sometimes intended. So one of the reasons for this local interpretation that Viola shows is that the agency that took over collectivizing agriculture, the Unified State Political Authority (OGPU), was led by a person, Genrikh Yagoda, who wanted to do everything in secret for fear that the kulaks would figure out their plans ahead of time and disrupt things. So this meant that local officials usually didn't know what to do, as communicating in secret is really inefficient and dumb. Local officials never really knew whether they would be punished or rewarded for going beyond their orders in inflicting intense brutality. And the fact that they were often rewarded encouraged them to do so, or that they would be punished for not being brutal when, they weren't explicitly told to. So then in 1931, local officials began to interpret orders for confiscation of foodstuffs as absolute, especially in places like Kazakhstan, the Black Earth regions of Russia, and above all, Ukraine. So the Soviet Union began aggressively exporting food in this period too, again to fund industry. But they were especially suspicious of Ukrainians. Western Ukraine had declared independence after the revolution, and it was the site of significant fighting during the Civil War. Ethnic Ukrainians lived in the USSR and neighboring Poland, and Stalin worried about their and Polish nationalism. So local officials naturally assumed that Ukrainian peasants were particularly reactionary. When requisitions became more than they could handle, many also did revolt, which made the Soviets even more repressive. And many had been revolting from the beginning. Not many, some. So the result of all of this was a massive famine that hit agricultural Ukraine the hardest. In this artificial famine, the Holodomor, roughly 1 million Ukrainians and Russians in the Don region died. Some estimates that as many as 12 million people died um, are, you know, are regularly printed. But the best scholarly estimates are still devastatingly high, between 1 and 3 million people. Conquest, whose reading I gave you, estimates 5 million people. So by the time of the Holodomor, and this is always problematic, not knowing, and it really shows just that these people didn't matter. That we're estimating with errors in rounding errors in the millions. That's horrific to think about. So, you know, by the time of the Holodomor, so many Soviet officials had adopted the mentality that if something wasn't working, you didn't try to fix it, you instead looked for the enemy that was stopping your thing from working. So the OGPU then began to give local officials quotas of how many kulaks and enemies they were to find, along with quotas for grain requisition. So many zealous local officials took it upon themselves to inflict horrific brutality in the name of meeting their quotas. You've got disturbing examples of this in your conquest readings, some of which I gave you a trigger warning over, and skip them. Don't feel obligated to read those pages. So with the harvest of 1933, the famine finally came to an end, but the Soviets would deny it had ever happened for decades. In the West, people were slow to recognize it as well, given what many perceived to be a false equivalency between this famine and the later Holocaust. Many Ukrainian nationalists later actively collaborated with the Nazis. They had their own SS regiment and actively perpetrated the Holocaust. Ukrainians played key roles in staffing the major death camps in German occupied Poland. So many have been loath to allow the Ukrainian diaspora to compare this famine to a genocide they helped perpetrate. And only 15 countries currently recognize the Holodomor as an intentional act of genocide. So, to weigh in on the historiography, I should probably point out that none of the people who starved to death in the early 1930s were Nazis. There weren't Nazis in Ukraine yet. I mean, there were a handful, but even though some of their relatives who survived would become such after Germany invaded the Soviet Union a decade later. So, recognizing and honoring Ukrainian victims of an artificial famine can be done while still condemning a minority of Ukrainians who were later Holocaust perpetrators. These don't need to be mutually exclusive, and they only are when people imagine, nations and ethnicities to be, uh, unified wholes. When we somehow give them personhood, when we say the Ukrainians did this, as if the actions of one member of a group are somehow reflective of the entire group. I mean, that's the kind of nationalistic groupthink that leads to justifying these kind of atrocities. The Holodomor happened because Stalin believed that all villagers were suspect, that all villagers needed to collectively pay the price to uh, create the agriculture that he felt the Soviet Union needed. The Holocaust happened because the dim-witted extreme nationalists of Europe in the 1930s and 40s believed that somehow Jewish people, all Jewish people, were responsible for both the excesses of communism and capitalism simply because a few Jewish people happened to be prominent in both systems. Um, that's dumb thinking, and it doesn't get you anywhere. So, you know, we can recognize and honor victims of all. And with the current crisis in Ukraine, I mean, right now, the fact that there's a military buildup by Russia on their border and the United States is acting belligerent in the Black Sea, I think it would be helpful if Ukrainians and Russians could deal with this history. Um, it would actually calm tensions a lot if the government of Russia would formally apologize for Soviet era crimes against Ukrainians. And it would help too if the government of Ukraine would formally apologize for World War II era militaries that fought and murdered in the name of Ukrainian nationalism on behalf of Hitler. But for our purposes, we can at least celebrate that both Russia and Ukraine today produce more than enough food for themselves and actually are becoming some of the largest exporters of cereals in the world. And just to pause and celebrate for a moment, Russia is actually the number one exporter of grain right now. It has been since 2019 when it surpassed the United States of America. And Ukraine, Ukraine, which is the size of the state of Texas, is in fifth place. So Ukraine is the fifth largest exporter of cereals in the world. So, they're doing something right today, and it is just horrible to think that these fertile, beautiful regions of the world were once the site of so much suffering, um, easily avoidable famine. So they're being farmed the way they should be, I think, with lots of modern practices and no mass murder. So let's all fight for peace. All right, so this was a difficult topic to cover, but an important one. Stalinism would later be seen as a model for developing countries to follow, and this was only possible because of the total erasure of the victims I've discussed today. So go ahead and try your hand at the bonus question I put here, and as always, reach out to me if there's anything you're having difficulty understanding. All right, hope you all have a good week.